Hey everybody, we are teaching Tilt Brush, and today's episode of Teaching Tilt Brush is comparing the unlit brushes to the shaded brushes, and how you can use them together to create different forms of art. So we're going to see which exactly ones we're talking about here. There are three main brushes that are referred to as the unlit brushes. They're called unlit because the lighting in your sketch does not affect them. They're just pure solid color. So on the first page of brushes, that center row called marker, if I paint with this brush, you can see it's just color. Even if I do in different directions around it, it's just flat. If I rotate, you can see the shapes I draw, but it appears just as flat color. A normal shaded brush, I'm going to use the one right below it, the flat brush. This one does react to light and shadow. So if I start drawing like this, you can see how the shadow, it even crosses itself. It's obviously a 3D piece, and as we rotate it, you can see around it. So we have two styles of painting. We have this unlit painting. Let's get these guys separated a little bit. You can move over here, please. So we've got this unlit flat color versus shaded, reflected with your highlights and shadows. So here's how we're going to use these and use these together. So on the first page, we have the marker as a flat tool. We also have an unlit hull. This does the same thing. If I make a shape with the unlit hull, this is a full 3D shape, but we only see it as flat color. If I use one of the normal hulls, here's where you can see the shadows and the highlights. They are both 3D hull shapes, but the unlit hull has no highlights and shadows. Finally, on the same tool panel, the wire brush. Even if I make it big, the wire brush has no highlight and shadow. Whereas the other, like the icing, this one does have highlight and shadow. Unlit, shaded. So those are the types of brushes we're talking about today. And we're going to look at how we can use them together to make more effective art. Usually these unlit brushes are just to fill in space, fill in regions. So if I'm using any of my normal brush techniques to do sketching, to do drawing, maybe I can grab a thin wire pen so I can draw some faces here. We'll draw a profile that way. Now we'll get some eyes. We'll get the mouth going here. We'll get some cheekbones. So I'm making, it's a sketch of a head, but as you can see, since it's a line drawing, it's hard to see it as a solid object. Hard to see what's the front, what's the back, that type of thing. Now, if I go in with a normal shaded brush, when I go in painting in behind it, or if I'm using the matte hull, when I go in to paint behind it, we're going to get shadows and highlights. Especially if the brush I was painting with, let's fill this in a little bit here, especially if the brush I was painting with also has shadows and highlights. You can see as I draw in over these pieces, you can see the shadows of the line really start to interfere with what I'm trying to do here. So the advantage of using these unlit pieces is I can now go in with this unlit shape. And because it is unlit, I'm going to fill it in, but I don't have to worry about how the shadows and highlights respond. So now I can actually rotate this around, and we can see the black lines, and the shape of the face is filled in. Now I'm actually going to make it nearly white, and fill. Oops, that's not fill. There's my fill. A little too white. Let's tone it down just a little bit. There. Now you can see it almost disappears. The shape disappears into the background. Let's see if I can get it to match perfectly. Too light. There, that's almost perfect. So now we can see the lines that were drawn, but my unlit shape fills it in so we don't see through it. And if I can have my unlit color be close to the background color, it really gives this sketch a lot more solidity. So these unlit pieces are made to fill in gaps, fill in solid objects, so a sketch gets much more of a solid feeling. So if I'm going to erase these guys in here, and now I go in with one of the unlit paint brushes, I can again paint in like this, and you can see how it fills it in. Let's paint out like that a little bit. So again, I'm trying to hide the lines that are behind the perspective. So let me get out of the way here. With the brush tool, it's harder to fill in these large 3D objects. But with like the unlit hull, I can fill in the shape of the head and not have shadows and highlights of the lines I'm trying to draw around it. So the wire I'm using here is also an unlit wire, which is why there's no shadow on a normal thing. If I put in a normal hull in here, one with shadows and highlights, get a little nose, get a little chin, that type of thing. If I had done the actual black lines, the wire is another unlit tool, so it doesn't cast a shadow. If I had done those lines with a normal shaded tool, those lines would cast shadows themselves. So I'm going to grab the icing, make it really small so it's just a pinpoint line, but it will still cast shadows of its own. So you can see how it's obvious separate pieces, a shadow being cast. Whereas if I switch to the wire tool, wire is unlit, wire does not cast a shadow of its own. So using the unlit tools, even in conjunction with lit pieces, I can now draw on it without it casting a shadow on it. I'm going to switch to the unlit marker tool. And I can use different colors, so it's like I'm painting on the surface. I'm not actually painting on the surface, it's unlit. It's not casting a shadow. The normal marker, you can see how it casts shadows. Unlit versus lit. And I'll even draw in one of those lines here up in the corner. So we can see how unlit doesn't cast a shadow. It looks like there's a shadow. That's because that's one big line. It's a double line I made here. See? It's not actually casting a shadow. So unlit tools for filling in regions, for flat color, normal shaded tools to cast shadows, to have highlights, that type of thing. So depending on the art you're trying to create, the different tools will let you lay down colors different ways. So if I've got my shaded tool here forming the shape, and I want to give him tattoos and things, I don't want the tattoos to cast shadows, so I'm going to switch to one of my unlit tools, make it small enough to make lines, and now I can actually draw lines on it, and it looks like they're part of the surface. They're not actually above the surface unless you get really close and turn. Now you can see how it's a little bit above the surface. But because it's unlit, there's no light-shadow interaction. For details, for filling in regions, for giving it a flat inside so we can see the contours and the sketches we've done around it. Our three unlit tools are our unlit marker, our unlit hull, and the wire. They will never cast shadows. They will never receive shadows. Most of the other tools are standard shaded tools. So paper, duct tape, you can actually see the shadows they cast. They are actually shaded objects. A couple of them are not. Things like our animated tools, like streamers, You'll notice don't cast shadows, or our neon pulse. Even though it's going right up against it, there's no shadow from the neon pulse. So they won't interact with the other things. They're not really unlit. They're just their own light source, their own interactive pieces. We also have cell vinyl and tune. These are a combination type of brush. So you can see as I paint it in curves and things, it is unlit. There's no shadows being cast. But because it has that black outline, it's still easily seen as multiple brush strokes. It doesn't flow together as one solid piece like the actual unlit colors do. So here's our cell vinyl with a black outline, as opposed to the unlit. I'm even going to go some behind and some on top. So you can see how the unlit doesn't get the outline, doesn't get that perspective. The only reason why we have perspective with a cell vinyl is the heavy black outline. But we can use our unlit to then fill it in, so I only have the outer outline, but the inner outline looks all filled in because it's covered up with this unlit. So now we have the outer outline. Seen from the other side, we can see the cell vinyl strokes. Wire and tune are also both unlit cylinders. So here's the tune. There is a hint of a shadow. If we look really close, a highlighted edge is a little paler than the shadow under edge. However, it doesn't cast a shadow. So even as I'm spiraling around itself, we don't have the vertical stripe. Whereas if I did this with a truly shadowed piece, that's with the tune, doing the same thing with the icing, you can actually see the shadows being cast in here up against the icing. Whereas with the tune, there are none of these inside shadows. Unlit versus shaded. So depending on the art you're piecing, if you're trying to show depth, trying to show different layers, make sure it's a shaded tool so we can actually see the light and shadow interaction. If you're trying to make it blend together as one piece, if you're trying to do a solid inside so that we can then see light sketching above it, let me go to one of my light sketching tools here. Now we're seeing we've got light and shadow interaction on these little lines, but my unlit background behind it doesn't get any of that shadow type of interaction. Now we have a shaded brush. Now we can see all of the shadow interaction. But without the shaded piece, whoops, a little too much there. You don't get any of that shadow interaction on the background object itself. These are all coming from the actual pieces of paper that we painted in themselves. We hope this has been helpful. These type of tools help you really get varied design, a lot more detail into the things that you create. Practice with these things. They don't come instantly to everybody, so feel free to take your time, do a bunch of pieces of art. You don't have to save them, or if you want, you can save them to Polly. Give us the link in the comments so we can see what sort of stuff you guys are creating with these tools. Likewise, if you have any questions about what we've done or other ways you'd like to see us using these things, let us know in the comments below. We're here to show you how to use these tools better and have more fun, so let us know what sort of things you'd like to do. Thanks for joining us for teaching Tilt Brush. I hope you have a good time. Have fun tilting.